Welcome to the Story Vault, Buried Truths, where history's most unsettling truths are kept under lock and key. Language has a funny way of hiding violence. We repeat phrases without thinking, little verbal fossils passed from one generation to the next, never stopping to ask where they came from or who paid the price for them. Mad as a hatter. We say it when someone's a little odd, a little scattered, a little too intense. It sounds playful, almost charming, but this phrase wasn't born from whimsy. It was born from workshops filled with poison, from trembling hands and fractured minds, from men who slowly lost control of their bodies while doing honest labor. Long before the Mad Hatter poured tea in Wonderland, real hatters walked the streets of England, their eyes darting, their speech broken, their emotions swinging wildly between laughter and rage. People laughed at them, children mocked them, doctors shrugged. No one called it what it was: poisoning. In the 18th and 19th centuries, hat makers were quietly inhaling mercury vapor day after day, year after year, until their nervous systems began to fail. They didn't just act mad, they were being chemically dismantled from the inside out. And yet the hats kept coming, tall, elegant, fashionable, symbols of respectability, built on invisible suffering. Tonight, we're pulling that phrase apart, tracing it back through soot-filled workshops, through industrial greed and medical neglect, through a time when madness wasn't treated, it was manufactured. This is the real story behind the Mad Hatter, not fantasy, not metaphor, just mercury, money, and men who paid the cost. So take a breath, settle in, and listen closely, because once you hear this story, you'll never hear that phrase the same way again. Let's open the vault.
Chapter 1. Hats, Status, and Social Power. Before the poison, before the tremors, before the madness had a name, there were hats. Not as fashion accessories in the modern sense, but as social signals, carefully constructed messages worn on the head, broadcasting who you were, where you stood, and how seriously the world should take you. In Old England, what you wore above your brow mattered almost as much as what you carried in your pocket. To understand why hat makers were so widespread and why their suffering went unnoticed for so long, you have to understand just how powerful a hat once was. In the 17th and 18th centuries, England was a rigidly stratified society. Class wasn't just a matter of wealth, it was something you displayed, something you performed every day in public. Clothing acted as a language, and hats were among its loudest words. They were worn constantly, removed only in moments of respect or submission. A man's hat was often the first thing noticed and the last thing taken off. A well-made felt hat signaled respectability. It said you were orderly, dependable, and part of the social machine. A poorly made or worn-out hat suggested the opposite, that you were struggling, unreliable, or slipping down the ladder. For gentlemen, hats were symbols of authority. Tall felt hats, often made from beaver fur, were favored by professionals, landowners, and merchants. Their height alone conveyed power. The taller the hat, the greater the presence. In crowded streets, a man's hat made him visible before his face did. For tradesmen and artisans, hats were proof of legitimacy. A proper hat meant you were employed, established, and worth doing business with. For laborers, owning even a single decent hat could be the difference between being taken seriously or dismissed entirely. And for the poor, hats represented aspiration. They were expensive, durable items meant to last for years. A good felt hat might be passed down through a family, repaired again and again, reshaped as styles changed. It was not uncommon for a man to own several coats, but only one hat.
So the demand was relentless. As England expanded through trade and empire, fashion followed. Beaver felt hats became particularly desirable, prized for their strength, water resistance, and smooth finish. Rain rolled off them, they held their shape, they looked refined. And refinement, in an era obsessed with appearances, was everything. But England didn't have beavers. Those came from North America, where the fur trade exploded to meet European demand. Entire ecosystems were stripped to keep English heads covered in luxury. The beaver pelt became one of the most valuable commodities of the age, rivaling gold in some markets. By the time the fur arrived in England, it passed into the hands of hatters, skilled craftsmen whose work sat at the intersection of chemistry, labor, and fashion. Hat-making was not a small cottage industry. By the early 1700s, it was a booming trade. Cities like London, Manchester, and Stockport became centers of felt production. Workshops ranged from small family-run operations to larger manufactories employing dozens of men. Hatters were not unskilled laborers. Their work required precision, experience, and physical endurance. Turning loose animal fur into a smooth, structured hat was an involved, multi-step process that demanded constant attention. The public admired the product. Few ever considered the process. Hatters worked long hours, often starting before dawn and continuing until evening. Their shops were hot, humid, and loud. Steam rose from vats. Wooden mallets thudded rhythmically. The smell of wet fur and chemicals clung to the air and to the men themselves. Yet from the outside, the trade seemed respectable. Hatters earned a modest but stable living. They dressed well enough. Their work clothed the upper classes. They were seen as craftsmen, not factory hands, which made their decline all the easier to ignore. At first, there were small changes. A hand that shook slightly while lifting a cup, a voice that hesitated mid-sentence, an unusual irritability that co-workers laughed off. Long hours, people said. Nerves, others whispered. A weak constitution. No one questioned the work itself, because the hats were perfect, and that perfection mattered more than the people who made them.
England was entering an age of mass consumption. Fashion cycles accelerated, demand increased, workshops pushed production harder, faster, cheaper. Any method that improved efficiency was welcomed, especially one that made felt stronger and easier to shape. Hatters did not invent mercury use out of malice, they inherited it. The process, known later as carroting, produced superior felt. It was reliable, it was profitable, and for a long time it appeared harmless. Hatters were proud of their craft. Many trained apprentices, passing techniques down through generations. Fathers taught sons, masters trained boys barely into their teens. The trade became a family identity, which made the consequences devastatingly intimate. As years passed, more hatters began to show the same symptoms.
tremors became common enough to joke about. Emotional instability was shrugged off as temperament. Memory loss was attributed to age, even in young men. The culture of work demanded endurance, not questioning. To complain was to risk unemployment. To leave was to abandon your livelihood. To admit weakness was to fail. And so the hats kept coming. Top hats worn in Parliament, felt hats worn by merchants, uniform hats worn by soldiers, each one carrying a silent cost. By the time the phrase "mad as a hatter" entered common speech, the damage was already woven into society. People noticed the behavior long before they understood the cause. They saw the madness without seeing the poison. The hat remained a symbol of dignity. The hatter became the punchline. And the irony is brutal. An industry built to create symbols of control and order was quietly dismantling the minds of the men who sustained it. This wasn't madness born of imagination or eccentricity. It wasn't whimsy. It wasn't choice. It was the slow erosion of the nervous system, disguised by fashion and status, protected by profit and tradition. And all of it began here, with hats, with power, with a society that valued appearance over people. In the next chapter, we'll step inside the process itself and meet the chemical that changed everything. Because once Mercury entered the workshop, the fate of the hatter was sealed.
Chapter 2. The Poison in the Process. To understand how hatters were poisoned, you have to resist the urge to imagine something dramatic. There were no skull and crossbones labels, no sudden collapses, no choking clouds that sent men running from the room. The danger was quieter than that. It arrived dissolved in water, brushed onto fur, heated gently, and inhaled slowly, day after day, until the body no longer remembered what it was like to be well. The chemical at the center of it all was mercury nitrate. By the late 17th century, mercury had already earned a reputation as a useful substance. Alchemists prized it, physicians prescribed it, dentists used it. It was thought to be powerful, transformative, even medicinal in controlled doses. The idea that it might be dangerous was not unknown, but the belief that small, repeated exposures could destroy the mind was not yet widely accepted. Hat makers didn't choose mercury because it was poisonous, they chose it because it worked. The problem hatters faced was structural. Animal fur, especially beaver and rabbit, does not naturally want to become felt. The fibers are smooth, slick, and resistant to binding. Without intervention, they slip past one another, refusing to lock together. Mercury nitrate solved that problem beautifully. When fur was treated with the solution, the fibers roughened. Under heat and pressure, they hooked together tightly, shrinking into dense, uniform felt. The process produced hats that were stronger, smoother, and more durable than anything made without it. Hatters called the step carroting, named for the orange tint the mercury solution gave the fur. The color was considered a sign of quality. Properly carroted fur meant easier work and a better final product. No one thought to ask what the orange color meant for the people applying it. The process began early in the production chain. Raw pelts arrived stiff, greasy, and pungent.
Workers cleaned them, shaved them, and stretched them across frames. Then the mercury nitrate solution was brushed or dipped onto the fur, often by hand.
Bare hands. No gloves, no masks, no washing stations beyond cold water. From there, the treated fur was dried, then subjected to heat and steam during felting. This was where the true danger emerged. Mercury nitrate does not stay politely in solution when heated. It releases mercury vapor, an invisible gas that moves easily through the air and even more easily into the lungs. Inhaling mercury vapor is especially dangerous because it bypasses many of the body's natural defenses. It enters the bloodstream quickly and crosses into the brain with devastating efficiency. The workshops, already poorly ventilated, became ideal environments for exposure. Steam rose continuously. Windows were often kept closed to maintain humidity. The air was thick, warm, and stagnant. Hatters breathed it without realizing they were doing so. There was no immediate pain, no warning sign, no sensation that would make a man step back and say something is wrong. The poison worked slowly, patiently, accumulating inside the body. Once inhaled, mercury does not simply pass through. It binds to tissues, it disrupts enzymes, it interferes with the nervous system at a cellular level, damaging neurons and altering brain chemistry. The earliest symptoms were subtle: a slight tremor in the fingers, a twitch in the eyelid, a feeling of restlessness that didn't match the situation. These changes were easy to dismiss. Long hours caused fatigue. Hot workshops caused irritability. Everyone shook a little when they were tired. But the exposure continued. Weeks became months, months became years, and the tremors grew worse. Hatters began to struggle with tasks that once felt automatic. Fine motor control deteriorated, writing became difficult, threading needles turned frustrating. Precision, essential to the craft, began to slip away. At the same time, emotional changes emerged. Men who were calm became anxious. Men who were patient became short-tempered. Small inconveniences triggered outsized reactions. Laughter gave way to sudden anger, then to deep, inexplicable sadness. This was not coincidence.
Mercury disrupts the brain regions responsible for emotional regulation. It alters neurotransmitter function, particularly in areas governing mood, impulse control, and memory. The result is a condition later recognized as erethism, marked by irritability, depression, paranoia, and social withdrawal. Hatters didn't know that word. They just knew they didn't feel like themselves anymore. Some became withdrawn, avoiding conversation and eye contact. Others became erratic, speaking too quickly or too slowly, losing their train of thought mid-sentence. Stuttering, once rare, became common. Families noticed the changes first. Wives described husbands who came home exhausted, silent, or unreasonably angry. Children learned to avoid provoking sudden outbursts. Friends drifted away. The men themselves often felt ashamed. They sensed their own deterioration, but lacked a framework to understand it. In a culture that valued stoicism and self-control, emotional instability was deeply stigmatized. And still, they returned to the workshops, because stopping did not stop the symptoms. Once mercury enters the brain, damage can continue even after exposure ends. But hatters didn't know that either. All they knew
was that missing work meant lost wages, and lost wages meant hunger. Some hatters attempted to protect themselves in small, improvised ways. They worked with windows open when possible. They avoided the hottest parts of the process when they could. But these measures were inconsistent and largely ineffective. Others turned to alcohol. Drinking dulled the anxiety. It slowed the tremors temporarily. It provided a sense of relief at a cost. Alcohol worsened Mercury's effects on the nervous system, accelerating cognitive decline. By the time a hatter's condition became severe enough to prevent work, he was often dismissed. No compensation, no diagnosis, no acknowledgement of cause. The workshop did not change. The process did not change. Another man took his place. This was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as the natural order of labor. The hats were still needed. The demand was still there, and the poison was invisible. What makes this chapter of history particularly disturbing is that mercury poisoning was not entirely unknown. Physicians had documented its effects in miners, mirror makers, and other trades, but the connection to hat-making remained fragmented and contested. Industry resisted regulation. Manufacturers argued that the benefits outweighed the risks. Some claimed the symptoms were exaggerated. Others blamed personal weakness or moral failing. It was easier to pathologize individuals than to confront a profitable process. And so the poison remained embedded in the trade, normalized, tolerated, and quietly devastating. Hatters didn't go mad. They were methodically dismantled by a system that prized efficiency over humanity, results over responsibility, and all of it happened in plain sight. In the next chapter, we'll put a name to what was happening inside their bodies and inside their minds, because once doctors finally recognized the condition, the truth became impossible to ignore. But by then, generations had already paid the price.
Chapter 3. Erethism, the madness with a name. For a long time, what was happening to hatters had no name. Symptoms were noticed, discussed, even gossiped about, but they existed as isolated observations rather than as pieces of a single coherent picture. A trembling hand here, a sudden rage there, a man who could no longer finish a sentence without losing it halfway through. Each case was treated as individual misfortune, and without a name, there could be no accountability. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine stood at an uneasy crossroads. Physicians were beginning to move away from superstition and toward observation, but the tools to understand neurological disease were still crude. Mental illness, in particular, was poorly understood and deeply stigmatized. Emotional instability was often interpreted as moral failure, weakness of character, or spiritual imbalance. When hatters began to behave erratically, few doctors thought to look at their occupation. Instead, they looked at the men. Medical journals from the period describe patients who were nervous, melancholic, overly excitable, or subject to irrational fear. These labels explained behavior without explaining cause. Treatment focused on restraint rather than remedy, rest, isolation, cold baths, purging, bleeding. None of it addressed the poison. The term that would eventually connect the dots was erethism. Derived from the Greek word erethizine, meaning to irritate or to excite,
Erethism was used to describe a cluster of behavioral and neurological symptoms associated with mercury exposure. It did not appear suddenly, nor was it immediately linked to hat-making. The concept emerged slowly, built case by case, observation by observation. Physicians began to notice patterns. Men exposed to mercury in different trades, gold miners, mirror makers, instrument craftsmen, exhibited remarkably similar symptoms: tremors, excessive salivation, memory loss, depression, extreme shyness alternating with explosive anger. But it was among hatters that the condition became unmistakable. The symptoms were so consistent, so widespread, and so visible that they could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The classic presentation of erethism included physical, cognitive, and emotional deterioration.
Physicians began to notice patterns. Men exposed to mercury in different trades, gold miners, mirror makers, instrument craftsmen, exhibited remarkably similar symptoms: tremors, excessive salivation, memory loss, depression, extreme shyness alternating with explosive anger. But it was among hatters that the condition became unmistakable. The symptoms were so consistent, so widespread, and so visible that they could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The classic presentation of erethism included physical, cognitive, and emotional deterioration. Physically, the most obvious sign was tremor. It often began in the hands, subtle enough to hide at first, but gradually worsening until it interfered with daily tasks. The tremor could spread to the face, lips, and tongue, making speech difficult and sometimes slurred. Fine motor skills deteriorated. Writing became shaky. Tools slipped from grasp. Cognitively, memory began to fail. Hatters forgot instructions, misplaced tools, repeated themselves. Concentration became difficult. Tasks that once took minutes stretched into hours. Confusion crept in quietly, eroding confidence. Emotionally, the changes were often the most devastating. Men described feeling constantly on edge, unable to relax. Anxiety became pervasive. Simple social interactions felt overwhelming. Many developed what physicians of the time called morbid shyness, a profound discomfort around others, paired with an intense fear of judgment. This was often misunderstood as cowardice or eccentricity. But erethism also carried its opposite. Periods of withdrawal could be punctuated by sudden, uncontrollable outbursts of anger or excitement. These episodes appeared without warning and disappeared just as abruptly, leaving shame and confusion behind.
To families, it felt like living with a stranger. To employers, it looked like instability. To society, it looked like madness. The cruel irony was that many hatters remained fully aware of their decline. Unlike some forms of mental illness that impair insight, mercury-induced erethism often left cognition partially intact. Sufferers could recognize that something was wrong but lacked the ability to stop it. They knew they were changing. They simply could not reverse it. Physicians who studied erethism began to understand that mercury did not merely affect the body, it rewired behavior. It altered how the brain processed emotion, impulse, and memory. Modern neuroscience would later confirm what these early doctors observed. Mercury damages neurons, disrupts synaptic signaling, and interferes with neurotransmitters critical to mood regulation. But in the 19th century, this knowledge remained incomplete and contested. Some doctors argued that erethism was a distinct occupational disease. Others insisted it was a form of hysteria or nervous exhaustion. Still others blamed alcohol, poverty, or heredity. Industry seized on that uncertainty. If the cause was unclear, responsibility could be avoided. Manufacturers pointed to the lack of consensus among physicians as proof that mercury was not to blame. They argued that if the chemical were truly dangerous, the effects would be immediate and universal. They dismissed long-term exposure as speculative. Hatters, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. As symptoms worsened, many were labeled insane. Those who could no longer work were sometimes committed to asylums, where their occupational history was rarely considered relevant. Records describe men admitted for mania, melancholia, or moral insanity, with no mention of mercury exposure. Inside these institutions, treatment focused on control rather than cure. Patients were restrained, isolated, or subjected to harsh therapies that did nothing to halt neurological damage. The diagnosis, when it existed at all, arrived too late. What makes erethism particularly tragic is that it was preventable. The condition did not arise from mysterious forces or unavoidable fate. It was the direct result of repeated, unprotected exposure to a known toxin. But acknowledging that truth required confronting uncomfortable questions about labor, profit, and responsibility. It was easier to medicalize the individual than to indict the system. And so erethism remained, for decades, a medical curiosity rather than a catalyst for reform.
The phrase, mad as a hatter, spread through popular language, reinforcing the idea that madness was intrinsic to the trade rather than imposed upon it. The name erased the cause while preserving the stereotype. By the time regulatory bodies began to seriously consider mercury's role, generations of hatters had already suffered irreversible damage. Erethism gave the madness a name, but it did not give it justice. In the next chapter, we'll leave the medical journals behind and step back into the workshops themselves, into the daily lives of the men who lived with these symptoms, worked through them, and were ultimately consumed by them. Because statistics and diagnoses tell only part of the story. The rest is written in trembling hands and unfinished sentences. Chapter 4. Life inside the hat workshops. To truly understand what mercury did to hatters, you have to see where it happened. Not in a laboratory, not in a doctor's office, but in the workshops where men spent most of their waking lives. Hat workshops in 18th and 19th century England were not grand factories in the modern sense. Many were narrow, low-ceilinged rooms tucked behind storefronts or clustered in industrial neighborhoods where the air already smelled of coal smoke and damp stone. Others were larger manufactories, converted warehouses where dozens of men worked side by side, each responsible for a single step in the process. Regardless of size, the conditions were remarkably similar. The rooms were hot, always hot. Felting required heat, steam, and moisture, and those elements were kept constant. Windows, when they existed at all, were often small and kept closed to maintain the humidity needed to shape felt properly.
In winter, the warmth was tolerable. In summer, it was suffocating. Steam rose continuously from vats and basins. It condensed on walls and ceilings, dripping back down in slow, uneven rivulets. Floors stayed damp. The air felt thick, heavy in the lungs, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of chemicals mixed with the animal smell of wet fur. This was the air hatters breathed for 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Work began early. Men arrived before sunrise, often after walking several miles from overcrowded housing. There was little ceremony to the start of the day. Tools were gathered, fires were stoked, vats reheated. The rhythm of labor resumed almost immediately, as if it had never stopped. The work itself was repetitive and physically demanding.
Raw pelts had to be cleaned and prepared. Fur was shaved, stretched, and sorted. Carroted fur was layered carefully, then subjected to rolling, pressing, and pounding to encourage felting. Each stage required attention and force. Mistakes meant wasted material, and wasted material meant lost wages or reprimands. Hatters worked hunched over benches, shoulders rounded, hands constantly in motion. The posture alone took a toll over time, but it was the fine motor control the job required that made the damage from mercury particularly cruel. As tremors developed, hatters fought to hide them. They learned to brace their wrists against the table, to grip tools harder than necessary, to work more slowly, hoping no one would notice. Some succeeded for a while, others did not. Speech, too, became a liability. Workshops were noisy, filled with the sounds of mallets striking felt, steam hissing, and men shouting instructions over the din. Stuttering or slurred speech made communication difficult and marked a man as unreliable. Hatters who struggled were often reassigned to less skilled tasks, paid less, or dismissed entirely. There were no sick days. Illness was not accommodated, it was punished. Breaks were short and infrequent. Meals were eaten quickly, often in the same rooms where mercury vapor lingered. Bread and cheese, maybe a bit of meat if wages allowed, water or weak ale to drink. No one washed their hands before eating, there was nowhere to do so properly. The poison followed them home. Mercury clung to clothing, to hair, to skin. Wives and children were exposed second-hand, though the effects were most severe in those who inhaled it directly. Some families noticed that children born to hatters were frailer, more prone to illness. The connection went unrecognized. Within the workshop, camaraderie existed, but it was strained by competition and fear. Hatters depended on one another, yet they were also replaceable. Apprentices waited eagerly for positions. Older workers felt pressure to prove they were still capable. Admitting weakness risked losing everything. So men joked about their shaking hands. They laughed off sudden mood swings. They called each other mad. Humor became a shield. Supervisors and workshop owners were often physically removed from the worst conditions. They oversaw production, but did not handle the chemicals directly. Their exposure was limited. Their risk was lower. When problems arose, they framed them as discipline issues rather than health concerns. A man who lashed out was reprimanded. A man who forgot instructions was scolded. A man who broke down was dismissed. The system did not recognize injury unless it was immediate and visible. Mental decline did not qualify. As symptoms progressed, some hatters became isolated within the workshop. Co-workers avoided them, wary of unpredictable behavior.
The affected men sensed this shift and withdrew further, creating a feedback loop of alienation and decline. For many, the workshop became a place of quiet humiliation. They remembered a time when their hands were steady, when their minds were sharp, when their work was praised. Now every task was a reminder of what they were losing. And yet, leaving the trade was not simple. Hat-making was specialized. Skills did not easily transfer to other professions. Age, education, and health limited options. A man who left the workshop often faced poverty or the workhouse. So they stayed, even as their bodies betrayed them. By the late stages of mercury poisoning, work became nearly impossible. Tremors worsened, speech deteriorated, emotional instability made cooperation difficult. At this point, dismissal was almost inevitable.
What happened next varied. Some hatters returned to their families, becoming dependent on wives or children who took on additional labor to survive. Others drifted, unable to maintain steady employment. A few were committed to asylums, their occupational history reduced to a footnote or omitted entirely. In official records, they were mad. In reality, they were used up. The workshop did not pause to mourn them. Production continued. New men arrived. New fur was carroted. New hats were shipped. The environment that destroyed one generation stood ready to destroy the next. Life inside the hat workshops was not dramatic in the way history often remembers suffering. There were no singular moments of collapse that demanded attention. Instead, there was erosion, slow, cumulative, and devastating. It happened in ordinary rooms, during ordinary workdays, to ordinary men. And because it was ordinary, it was allowed to continue. In the next chapter, we'll step outside the workshops and into the public eye, where hatters' symptoms became spectacle and society chose mockery over understanding. Because once the damage became visible, the response was not compassion. It was laughter.
Chapter 5. Public Perception. From Illness to Mockery. By the time the effects of mercury poisoning became visible outside the workshops, the story had already been partially written. The public did not see a chemical hazard. They did not see an occupational disease. They saw behavior. And behavior, untethered from explanation, is easy to judge. Hatters were among the first workers whose illness followed them into public space. Unlike miners or factory hands who labored out of sight, hatters lived and worked in towns and cities. They walked the same streets as their customers. They attended the same markets. They stood behind counters, measuring heads and shaping brims, their hands trembling in plain view. People noticed. At first, the observations were curious rather than cruel. A hatter who shook while taking measurements, another who struggled to count change, a third who seemed unusually withdrawn or easily flustered. These moments were filed away as quirks. But as the years passed and the symptoms grew more common, curiosity hardened into stereotype. Hatters were said to be nervy, unsteady, odd. When emotional instability entered the picture, sympathy quickly evaporated. Sudden anger, inappropriate laughter, or intense shyness made people uncomfortable. Discomfort invites distance, and distance invites dehumanization. It became easier to laugh than to ask questions.
In taverns and markets, jokes circulated about hatters who couldn't hold a glass steady or finish a sentence without stumbling over their words. Children mimicked their movements. Cartoons and pamphlets exaggerated their mannerisms for humor. These jokes were not especially vicious by the standards of the time. Public mockery was common, particularly toward the poor, the disabled, and those considered socially marginal. What made the treatment of hatters distinctive was its consistency. The behavior was widespread enough to be recognizable, and recognition gave birth to language. The phrase "mad as a hatter" did not appear overnight. It evolved gradually, shaped by repeated encounters and reinforced by shared assumptions. It was not originally an insult in the modern sense, but an observation turned into shorthand. Hatters, people said, were known for instability. No one asked why. In a society with limited understanding of mental health, unusual behavior was often attributed to character flaws. A man who lashed out was thought to be hot-tempered. A man who withdrew was thought to be weak. Emotional volatility was seen as moral failing rather than illness. This framing was convenient.
If the problem lay within the individual, society bore no responsibility. Medical professionals did little to challenge these perceptions. While some physicians recognized patterns of occupational illness, their findings rarely reached the public. Medical language stayed confined to journals and lectures, far removed from everyday life. Even when doctors suspected mercury poisoning, they often described it in abstract terms, disconnected from lived experience. Patients were cases, symptoms were presentations. The human cost was softened by clinical distance. Meanwhile, popular culture filled the gap. Print culture expanded rapidly during this period. Pamphlets, newspapers, and satirical illustrations circulated widely, shaping public opinion. Exaggerated characters were a staple of humor, and the Mad Hatter fit neatly into that tradition. He was portrayed as twitchy, excitable, absurd, harmless in the way that suffering becomes harmless once it's funny. This perception had real consequences. Hatters who showed symptoms found themselves avoided by customers. Employers hesitated to hire them. Landlords were reluctant to rent to them. Their reputations followed them, often exaggerated with each retelling. Once labeled unstable, a man's credibility evaporated. And because the stereotype was occupational, it spread indiscriminately. Healthy hatters were viewed with suspicion. Ill hatters were dismissed outright. The trade itself became associated with madness rather than with disease. This collective misunderstanding reinforced silence within the workshops. To admit symptoms was to confirm the stereotype. To seek help was to invite ridicule. To protest conditions was to risk being dismissed as irrational. Mockery became a tool of control. Even families were not immune. Wives of hatters were sometimes pitied, sometimes blamed. Children faced teasing. The stigma extended beyond the individual, shaping entire households. In extreme cases, public perception fed directly into institutionalization. Men who behaved erratically in public were more likely to be reported, restrained, or committed. Once inside asylums, their occupational history was rarely considered relevant. They were mad. And madness, in the eyes of society, required containment, not understanding. The irony is that many hatters were deeply aware of how they were perceived. Erethism often heightened self-consciousness and social anxiety. Men became painfully aware of their tremors, their speech difficulties, their emotional volatility. They feared judgment because they experienced it constantly. This awareness compounded their suffering. Isolation deepened, anxiety worsened, symptoms intensified. Mockery did not merely reflect illness, it amplified it. Language, once detached from truth, has a way of reshaping reality. The phrase "mad as a hatter" did more than describe a pattern, it solidified it. It transformed poisoned workers into caricatures and excused the conditions that harmed them. By the time the phrase entered dictionaries, its origin was already obscured. The cause disappeared, the behavior remained. What had begun as an occupational hazard ended as a cultural joke. And jokes, once established, are hard to dismantle. In the next chapter, we'll examine how this stereotype crossed into literature and myth, most famously through Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter, transforming industrial tragedy into whimsical nonsense. Because when suffering becomes entertainment, the truth is often the first thing lost.
Chapter 6. Lewis Carroll and the Mythic Mad Hatter. By the time Lewis Carroll introduced the Mad Hatter to the world in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, the phrase "mad as a hatter" was already familiar to British readers. It did not need explanation. That familiarity is important because it means Carroll did not create the idea. He inherited it. He drew from a cultural shorthand that had been shaped over decades of observation, misunderstanding, and quiet cruelty. And then, with a writer's instinct, he transformed it. Carroll's Mad Hatter is not tragic. He is absurd, talkative, illogical, and endlessly entertaining. He lives in a suspended moment, trapped at 6 o'clock, forever taking tea, forever asking riddles that have no answers. This version of the Hatter does not shake. He does not stutter. He does not slowly lose his livelihood. He is safe madness, contained madness, madness without consequences. That distinction matters. Carroll was a mathematician and logician by training, deeply interested in language, time, and perception. His nonsense was intentional, crafted to play with logic rather than to mirror reality. The Mad Hatter exists as a philosophical device, a way to upend order, challenge assumptions, and delight readers. But while the character itself is fictional, the cultural soil from which he grew was very real. Victorian readers would have recognized the reference immediately. They had seen hatters in the streets. They had heard the jokes. They had absorbed the stereotype. The character did not need a backstory because the public already supplied one. What Carroll did, perhaps unintentionally, was cement that stereotype into permanence. Once the Mad Hatter entered popular imagination, the phrase detached almost entirely from its industrial origins. It became literary, whimsical, childlike, safe to repeat without discomfort. The poison vanished. In its place stood a tea party. It is tempting to criticize Carroll for this transformation, but doing so misunderstands the cultural context.
Carroll did not invent the mockery, nor did he introduce the association between hatters and madness. He merely reflected what already existed, reshaping it into something that fit his narrative aims. And in Victorian England, literature wielded enormous power.
Books were not just entertainment, they were cultural anchors, passed down through families, read aloud, quoted, remembered. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland quickly became one of the most beloved works of the era. Its characters escaped the page. The Mad Hatter became a symbol. From that point on, the image of the eccentric hatter was no longer tied to real-world men struggling in workshops. It was tied to riddles, teacups, and colorful illustrations. The industrial context dissolved into fantasy. This shift had consequences. As the character gained popularity, the real-world suffering of hatters faded further from public consciousness. The phrase "mad as a hatter" became lighter, stripped of its original weight. To call someone a Mad Hatter was no longer to comment on poisoned labor. It was to reference a story. Cultural memory had been edited. Even as medical understanding of mercury poisoning improved, the mythic version of the Hatter overshadowed the truth. Literature proved more enduring than medical journals. Fiction outpaced reform. Interestingly, Carroll himself never confirmed that mercury poisoning inspired the character. Some scholars suggest he may have been influenced by a local eccentric hat maker rather than by the trade as a whole. Others argue that the character represents time, logic, or the arbitrary rules of adulthood. All of these interpretations can coexist. What matters is not Carroll's intent, but the effect. The Mad Hatter reframed madness as entertainment. He made it charming. He made it repeatable. And once madness is charming, it becomes easy to forget the cost. The Victorian era excelled at this kind of transformation. It turned industrial exploitation into progress, child labor into necessity, disease into moral weakness. Language was often used to soften harsh realities, to make them palatable to polite society. The Mad Hatter fit neatly into that pattern.
While readers laughed at tea parties, real hatters continued to suffer. Workshops did not close because of Carroll's book. Mercury use did not stop. The cultural moment passed without prompting reform. In fact, the popularity of the character may have reinforced complacency. If madness was funny, then it was not urgent. If it was whimsical, then it was not dangerous. This is not to say that literature is responsible for industrial harm, but it does play a role in how societies choose what to remember and what to forget. The mythic Mad Hatter replaced the real one in the collective imagination. And once replaced, the original story became harder to recover. Even today, when people think of the Mad Hatter, they picture eccentricity rather than illness. They imagine playful chaos rather than neurological damage. The connection to mercury poisoning often comes as a surprise. That surprise is the legacy of myth. It reminds us that stories do not merely reflect reality, they shape it. And when stories erase suffering, that suffering can be repeated elsewhere, under different names, in different industries. In the next chapter, we'll return to the real world, to the moment when science began to catch up with suffering and evidence could no longer be ignored.
because eventually even myths are forced to reckon with facts. But the delay came at a cost measured in human lives.
Chapter 7. The Long Delay. When science began to understand what Mercury was doing to hatters, the tragedy was no longer unfolding in ignorance. It was unfolding in denial. This is the part of the story where the excuse of not knowing falls apart, where evidence accumulates, warnings multiply, and yet meaningful change stalls. Not because solutions were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. The long delay was not the absence of knowledge, it was the refusal to act on it. As early as the late 18th century, physicians across Europe had documented mercury's toxic effects. Miners exposed to mercury fumes showed tremors and cognitive decline. Mirror makers who used mercury to coat glass developed similar symptoms. Dentists handling mercury amalgams complained of nervous disorders. These cases were recorded, discussed, published. By the early 19th century, medical literature increasingly recognized mercury as a neurotoxin. The term erethism mercurialis began appearing with greater frequency, describing the precise constellation of symptoms hatters displayed. The connection was there. What was missing was urgency. Medical science at the time operated in silos. Occupational health was not a formal discipline. Physicians treated individuals, not industries. When patterns emerged, they were often treated as curiosities rather than calls to action. Even when doctors suspected mercury, they struggled to prove causation to a standard that industry would accept. Long-term exposure, delayed symptoms, and variability between individuals made the case easier to dispute. Manufacturers exploited that uncertainty. Hat-making was profitable. Felt hats were in constant demand. Any change to the process risked higher costs, lower output, or inferior products, at least in the short term. Mercury worked. It was familiar. It was embedded in training and tradition. Replacing it meant rethinking the entire production system. And so manufacturers resisted. They questioned the science. They demanded absolute proof. They framed illness as anecdotal. Some argued that if mercury were truly dangerous, all hatters would be affected equally. Others claimed that only careless workers suffered, implying personal responsibility rather than systemic failure. The burden of proof was placed not on the process, but on the poisoned. Government oversight was minimal. Industrial regulation, where it existed at all, focused on visible hazards, machinery accidents, fires, structural collapses. Invisible dangers were harder to legislate. Mercury had no smell, no immediate effect, no dramatic moment of injury. It was perfectly suited to be ignored. Public health reformers did exist, and some raised concerns, but their influence was limited, and their warnings often drowned out by economic interests. The Industrial Revolution had already normalized a certain level of human cost in the name of progress. Hatters were not unique in this regard. Across industries, workers suffered exposure to lead, arsenic, phosphorus, and other toxins. What made hatters distinctive was not the danger itself,
but how visible the effects became, and how easily they were reframed as madness. That reframing proved devastating. If symptoms were mental, they were treated as personal. If personal, they were not industrial. If not industrial, they were not regulated. This logic loop protected manufacturers while isolating workers. Even as evidence mounted, reform lagged. In Britain, mercury use in hat-making continued well into the mid-19th century. Some workshops experimented with alternatives, but adoption was slow and inconsistent. There was no centralized mandate, no enforcement mechanism. Change depended on individual owners choosing ethics over efficiency. Most did not. Meanwhile, the men continued to suffer.
Medical records from the period show repeated cases of hatters presenting with advanced symptoms, tremors so severe they could not feed themselves, emotional instability that made social interaction impossible, cognitive decline that resembled dementia. Doctors could describe the condition, but they could not reverse it. Mercury damage to the nervous system is often permanent. Once neurons are destroyed, they do not regenerate. The best physicians could offer was removal from exposure, something most hatters could not afford. Treatment options were limited and often misguided. Rest, fresh air, dietary changes. In some cases, mercury exposure was ironically treated with additional mercury-based remedies, worsening the condition. The cruelty of this period lies not only in what was done, but in what was not. Workshops could have been ventilated, protective equipment could have been introduced, alternative chemicals could have been explored sooner. None of these were beyond reach, but they required acknowledging that the system was broken, and broken systems resist acknowledgement. The delay stretched on, measured not in years, but in lives. Apprentices entered the trade unaware of the risks. Older hatters deteriorated in plain sight. Families adapted to loss without explanation. By the time reforms finally gained momentum, the damage was largely complete. Mercury use declined gradually, replaced by safer felting methods as technology advanced and public health awareness improved. The change was not sudden, nor was it framed as restitution. It was simply progress, arriving late. What history often records as innovation is, in cases like this, an admission that suffering was tolerated until it could no longer be ignored. The science had spoken long before policy listened, and the cost of that delay was borne entirely by those with the least power to protest. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happened when the trade finally began to change, and what became of the men who survived long enough to see it, because even when the poison was removed, its legacy remained, etched into bodies, families, and language itself. Chapter 8. The End of the Mad Hatters. The end of the Mad Hatters did not arrive with fanfare. There were no public apologies, no reckoning, no moment when the trade collectively stopped, looked around, and admitted what had been done. Instead, the madness faded the way it had begun, slowly, unevenly, and almost quietly enough to be missed. By the mid to late 19th century, the world around the hat trade was changing. Advances in chemistry, manufacturing, and public health were beginning to reshape industrial practices, not out of sudden moral clarity, but because efficiency, cost, and safety were slowly being recalculated.
Mercury was no longer the unquestioned solution it once had been. Alternatives emerged, new felting techniques, different chemical treatments, mechanical processes that reduced the need for direct handling of fur. None were perfect at first, but they were good enough, and good enough, paired with mounting medical evidence, finally tipped the balance. In Britain, mercury nitrate use declined gradually. Some workshops abandoned it earlier than others. Some never formally acknowledged the change at all, simply adjusting their methods and moving on. There was no official declaration that the Mad Hatter era was over. It simply stopped producing new victims at the same scale. For those already affected, the end came too late. Hatters who had spent decades inhaling mercury vapor did not recover once exposure ended. Tremors often persisted. Emotional instability lingered. Cognitive decline continued. The damage once done was largely irreversible. Some men lived out their remaining years in quiet obscurity, supported by family members who had adapted to their limitations. Others, without support, slipped into poverty or institutional care. Records from asylums show aging hatters admitted for conditions that today would be recognized as neurological injury rather than psychiatric illness. Their suffering did not end with reform. It merely ceased to be reproduced. Younger generations entering the trade experienced a different reality. Workshops became marginally safer. Symptoms that had once been commonplace grew rare. The stereotype of the Mad Hatter slowly lost its living reference. But the phrase remained. Language does not update as quickly as conditions do.
By the early 20th century, few people could remember a hatter who trembled or raged in public. The real men behind the saying faded from memory. What persisted was the caricature. This, too, is part of how harmful systems end, not with clarity, but with forgetting. The disappearance of obvious victims allowed society to move on without reflection. The industry adjusted, consumers kept buying hats. The past was sealed off as an unfortunate but distant chapter. There was no compensation for those harmed, no formal recognition of occupational poisoning. Their injuries were not framed as injustice, but as tragedy. And tragedy, unlike injustice, demands nothing in return. Public health reforms expanded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, addressing sanitation, factory safety, and labor conditions. These efforts were broad and often reactive, shaped by crises rather than foresight. The lessons of the hatters were absorbed indirectly, folded into a general awareness that invisible hazards could be deadly. But the hatters themselves were rarely named. They became examples without acknowledgement. This erasure extended to history books. Industrial progress was celebrated. The costs were summarized, if mentioned at all. Mercury poisoning became a footnote, stripped of faces and voices. Yet the legacy endured in subtle ways. The decline of mercury use in hat-making contributed to broader recognition of occupational disease. It reinforced the idea that work environments could cause specific, identifiable illnesses. It helped lay groundwork for future protections, even if those protections arrived unevenly and late. In that sense, the hatters changed the world, not by choice, but by consequence. They were part of the slow, painful education of industrial society. The end of the Mad Hatters was not justice.
It was exhaustion. The system could no longer ignore the evidence. The cost-benefit calculation shifted. Progress moved on, leaving behind those it had already damaged. What remains today is a curious absence. We wear hats without thinking about how they're made. We use the phrase "mad as a hatter" without recalling its origin. The suffering has been fully abstracted. And abstraction is comfortable.
But if we pause here, at the end of this chapter, and look back, the shape of the story becomes clear. The madness was never a mystery. It was a symptom. The cause was known long before it was addressed. The end came not because the hatters were finally heard, but because society found a way to continue without them. In the next chapter, we'll confront what this story leaves behind, what it asks us to remember, and what it warns us about the next time progress demands a quiet sacrifice. Because the end of the Mad Hatters is not just an ending, it is a reminder. Chapter 9. What we choose to remember. History is written in choices. Not just the choice to record events, but the choice to emphasize some stories while leaving others in the margins. The story of the Mad Hatters illustrates this in a way that is both subtle and profound. It is a story about labor, disease, social perception, and above all, memory, or the lack of it. When we speak of hatters today, most of us picture a fictional character with a teapot in hand, a whimsical smile, a riddle on the tip of his tongue. Lewis Carroll's Mad Hatter, the eccentric, harmless figure at a never-ending tea party, is what survives in our imagination. But behind that image lies a far more unsettling reality, a reality of suffering, neglect, and preventable loss. What does it mean that the real hatters have largely been forgotten? That a phrase once describing very real illness has become a playful expression? It means, first and foremost, that society has a tendency to sanitize discomfort. The tremors, emotional breakdowns, and cognitive decline endured by men who shaped our fashion are abstracted into harmless entertainment. It is easier to laugh at madness than to reckon with systemic failure. Easier to read nonsense verse than to confront the reality of occupational poison. And so, memory becomes selective. The workshops where mercury vapors drifted, where men inhaled their livelihoods, and where families quietly witnessed the deterioration of loved ones, these places exist in historical records, yes, but rarely in collective imagination. Newspapers recorded deaths. Medical journals analyzed tremors, and court proceedings occasionally referenced disputes over labor. But the lived experience of the hatters, the anxiety, the isolation, the quiet humiliation, was largely erased. When we choose what to remember, we also choose to forget. And forgetting can be as powerful as remembering, shaping how the future interprets the past. Consider language. The phrase "mad as a hatter" survives because it is catchy, it is memorable, but it no longer communicates reality.
It tells us something about perception, about humor, and about the ease with which suffering can be turned into stereotype. It communicates cultural familiarity, not historical truth. The same pattern repeats across history. Industrial or societal harm is often reframed into folklore, myth, or shorthand, allowing society to avoid accountability. What is tragic becomes amusing. What is preventable becomes inevitable. What is human is abstracted into caricature. And yet, if we look closely, evidence of the real story persists. Medical texts document erethism. Letters and journals capture tremors, rages, and social withdrawal. Apprenticeships, guild records, and occupational manuals hint at the constant presence of Mercury and the physical strain of felting. These documents form a faint trail, a breadcrumb path that leads us back to lives otherwise obscured by myth. To remember the Mad Hatters fully, we must read these traces with care. We must imagine the sensation of standing in a workshop, fingers trembling while trying to shape a hat, of returning home exhausted, frustrated, and aware that one's own body is failing, of being seen as mad rather than ill. We must honor the lived experience of men whose labor and suffering went unrecognized. Memory also demands reflection. It asks us to confront why progress took so long, why industrial safety lagged behind medical insight, why societal mockery reinforced silence and stigma. And it asks us to consider the costs of ignoring evidence in favor of convenience, profit, or cultural comfort. There is a lesson here beyond the hat trade itself. Every industry that relies on human labor has the potential for similar hidden costs. Every time a society prizes efficiency over well-being, the Mad Hatters of that system emerge. They may not tremble in a workshop, they may suffer quietly elsewhere, but the pattern repeats. Recognizing the history of one poisoned trade helps illuminate the invisible suffering in others. And finally, memory requires storytelling. If the tale of the Mad Hatters is to endure honestly, it cannot be simplified to a phrase or a character. It must include the workshops, the tremors, the erethism, the families, and the slow march of science against denial. It must acknowledge the laughter, the mockery, and the indifference that allowed suffering to continue for decades. Remembering the Hatters is not simply an act of pity, it is an act of justice, however belated. It is a recognition that history is not only about victories and inventions, but also about the lives quietly consumed in the making of culture and commerce. And if there is hope in this story, it lies in the power of awareness. By reclaiming the narrative, by understanding what was ignored, we are better equipped to protect those at risk today. Awareness becomes prevention, knowledge becomes protection, memory becomes action.
Chapter 10. Locking the Vault. Lessons from the Mad Hatters. Here we are, at the final chapter of our journey through the story of the Mad Hatters. After the tremors, the workshops, the Mercury, the mockery, and even Lewis Carroll's whimsical tea parties, it's time to step back and see what this tale leaves behind, what it teaches us about work, society, and memory. Locking the vault isn't about closing the story entirely. It's about understanding it, and carrying its lessons forward. The first lesson is simple but too often ignored. People are not their symptoms. Hatters were called mad for decades. Public perception, popular culture, and even casual phrases painted them as eccentric, unstable, or foolish. But the reality was far more human and tragic. Their tremors were chemical, their mood swings neurological, and their struggles preventable. The men themselves were clever, skilled, and resilient, navigating a hazardous trade while their bodies and minds slowly betrayed them. When we reduce someone to a stereotype, we erase their humanity. And when we erase humanity, society justifies neglect. The story of the Mad Hatters reminds us to look beyond appearances and ask what is really happening here. The second lesson is about the cost of inaction. Science knew, medical records recorded, yet workshops continued to fill the air with mercury. Warnings existed decades before widespread reform. Profits, convenience, and societal blind spots delayed action, and the result was cumulative suffering. We see echoes of this today in industries and workplaces where health and safety are deprioritized, or where warnings are minimized because change is inconvenient. The Mad Hatters teach us that ignorance is sometimes voluntary, and the cost of waiting to act can be measured in human lives. The third lesson lies in language, myth, and memory. Mad as a Hatter survived, even flourished, long after the mercury fumes dissipated. Lewis Carroll turned tragedy into whimsy. Literature made suffering playful, and the reality faded from view. This is a lesson in cultural storytelling. Words are powerful, and they can obscure as much as they illuminate. Language shapes memory. It can memorialize, or it can erase. For those of us listening now, remembering the real story behind the phrase is an act of reclamation. It honors the Hatters whose hands shook, whose minds strained, and whose lives were transformed by a preventable hazard. And that leads to another, subtler lesson. Humor and humanity can coexist with tragedy, but only if we remember context. We can smile at the Mad Hatter at his tea party, at the riddles and the nonsense, at the quirky character who has entertained generations. But we must also remember the real men, the workshops, the tremors, and the families who suffered quietly behind the curtain of societal indifference. Understanding the context does not diminish enjoyment of the story, it enriches it. Finally, the story asks us to consider the legacy of overlooked labor. History tends to spotlight innovators, leaders, and heroes. But the Mad Hatters remind us that the ordinary workers, the people shaping hats, building factories, assembling goods, and keeping society running, carry unseen burdens. Their stories are just as important. Their suffering, their resilience, and their humanity deserve recognition. So, what does it mean to lock the vault?
It means holding these stories securely in memory, treating them as treasures rather than curiosities. It means acknowledging injustice, learning from it, and passing the lesson forward. And yes, it means telling the tale in a way that is compelling, accurate, and even a little entertaining. Because stories are remembered when they are lived in our imaginations. Before we close the vault completely, let's bring this full circle. Hatters were poisoned, they were mocked, they were immortalized in literature.
They were eventually protected by safer methods, but the cost was irreversible for many. And yet, through remembering, we give them a voice that was denied for decades. We honor the real people behind the phrases, the caricatures, and the myths. We respect their labor, their struggles, and their resilience. And we carry forward the lessons their lives have taught us about science, responsibility, empathy, and memory. So, as we step away from this story, here's a little encouragement, both to remember and to smile. Because history does not have to be grim, it can be enlightening and even a little playful, if we are willing to hold both the tragedy and the humor in our minds at once. And for those of you who made it to the end of the vault, here's a little parting quip, a nod to the phrase, and a wink at history itself. Next time someone says you're mad as a hatter, just smile, tip your imaginary hat, and remember, some of them really earned the title. And with that, we lock the vault, for now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories from the Story Vault, where the forgotten, the strange, and the remarkable await, because every story deserves to be opened, examined, and remembered, sometimes with a tremor, and sometimes with a laugh.